The bell of St. Bridget's rang across the valley that morning, its echo rolling through the cottonwood trees and scattering the dust along the main road where wagons waited. Clara Wynn clutched her small hymnal against her chest as she climbed the church steps, the sunlight catching in the loose threads of her faded blue dress. She'd sewn it herself the night before, every stitch a quiet prayer that this Sunday would be different, that the whispers about her late husband's debts would fade, that people might finally see her as more than what she'd survived. But towns like Willow Creek remembered everything. Women smiled too sweetly as she passed. Men tipped their hats without meeting her eyes. And still, she smiled back, because that was what you did when you had no one left to defend you but grace. The steps were slick from the morning dew, the boards splintered near the rail. When her boot caught a loose nail, the sound of tearing cloth cut through the choir's warm-up like a scream. The hem of her skirt split high along the side seam, and for one breathless second, the whole town froze. Mrs. Gable gasped loud enough for the doves on the roof to scatter. Laughter bubbled up from somewhere behind the benches, the cruel, nervous kind that fills the silence when mercy fails to appear. Clara's face went pale. She dropped her hymnal, hands trembling as she clutched the torn fabric against her knees. But there was no hiding what had already been seen. The pastor stammered her name. A child pointed. The church doors gaped open, but no one stepped forward. Then came the sound of boots on the porch. Steady, deliberate, the kind that made the laughter stop before it finished. Rhett Carson, broad-shouldered and quiet as the hills he worked, stepped through the crowd. He didn't say a word at first. He simply reached up, removed his wide-brimmed brown hat, and knelt beside her. "You're covered, ma'am," he said softly, holding it over the torn fabric like a shield made of sunlight. The crowd's noise faded into wind. She looked up, eyes wide, tears gathering where pride had broken. He met her gaze without pity, only respect. "Ain't no shame worth a good woman's dignity," he murmured. A blush rose to her cheeks as she nodded, clutching the edge of the hat while he helped her to her feet. Mrs. Gable's hand went to her mouth, the gossip dying in her throat. The pastor cleared his voice, uneasy, but the rancher's quiet presence left no space for judgment. Rhett guided Clara toward the side door, shielding her from the stairs until they disappeared into the shadow of the church. Inside, she caught her reflection in the stained glass, a woman halfway between humiliation and grace. "You didn't have to," she whispered. "Maybe not," he said, eyes kind. "But someone should have long before now." Outside, the bell rang again, its sound less like ceremony and more like forgiveness. As sunlight pooled through the colored glass and spilled across her torn dress, Clara realized that sometimes the smallest mercy could silence an entire town, and that maybe, just maybe, this was how redemption began. Not in sermons, but in small, unspoken acts of decency no one ever forgot. The murmur of voices drifted through the wooden walls like smoke, soft at first, then sharp when names began to rise. Clara Wynn sat on the bench in the back of the church, the borrowed coat pulled over her lap, her hands twisting the edge of a handkerchief she didn't remember bringing. The congregation sang, but their eyes kept flicking toward her. Curious, guilty, unsure of which sin was greater, her torn skirt or their laughter. The sunlight through the stained glass painted her face in bands of red and blue, colors that made her look both wounded and holy. Beside her, Rhett Carson stood near the doorway, his hat in his hands, head slightly bowed. He hadn't returned to his pew after what happened. Instead, he lingered where the light fell strongest, watching without apology. The pastor's sermon stumbled through forgiveness and humility, and though he didn't name her, every word seemed aimed her way. Clara's throat burned. She wanted to leave, but leaving would only prove them right. that she was fragile, that shame could undo her. When the hymn ended, she rose quietly, stepping into the center aisle. The floorboards creaked. Conversations died. Even the pastor paused mid-blessing as she walked toward the doors, her chin high though her heart pounded hard enough to tremble her frame. At the steps, Rhett turned slightly, waiting. "You shouldn't walk out alone," he said low. "They'll talk more if I don't," she replied. "Then let 'em," he said. "Their words don't weigh half what yours does." She blinked at that, surprised. "And what am I supposed to say?" "Nothing," he answered. "You already did." Outside. The air was clean, the morning wind drying her tears faster than she could hide them. Children chased each other near the hitching posts, their laughter innocent where the adults hadn't been. Rhett followed her down the steps, stopping when she turned to face him. "You shouldn't have interfered," she said softly. "It'll turn their talk toward you." "Maybe it's time they found better things to talk about," he said, sliding his hat back on. "You think that one act changes anything?" "I think kindness changes everything," he said simply. She looked at him for a long moment, unsure whether to thank him or cry again. "You don't even know me." "Don't have to," he said. "I saw enough." The wind tugged at her torn skirt, and she clutched it tighter. "I'll sew it," she murmured. "Patch it tonight." "Then let me fix the step that did it," he said. "Seems only fair." She almost smiled, but stopped herself. "You'd do that?" "I'd do a lot less if it kept good people from hanging their heads." The church bell rang again, calling the next service, but neither of them moved. He nodded once, touched the brim of his hat, and started toward the hitching rail. "Thank you," she said quietly behind him. He paused, turning back with that same calm steadiness. "Ma'am," he said, "ain't a man alive who shouldn't thank you for reminding us what decency looks like." Then he mounted his horse and rode off, leaving her on the steps, the torn edge of her dress fluttering in the wind like a flag of something unspoken. Fragile, yes, but free. By afternoon, the churchyard had emptied, leaving behind only silence and the smell of cedar and sunlight. Clara Wynn returned with a basket of tools she borrowed from the carpenter's shed, determined to fix the step herself before anyone else whispered about it. The nail that had caught her skirt still jutted like a cruel little memory, glinting in the light. She set her sewing box down, rolled her sleeves, and went to work. Her fingers trembled, not from the hammer's weight, but from the way humiliation still echoed in her bones. Every strike seemed to drive the morning further away, but not far enough. She didn't hear the hoofbeats until a shadow fell across the steps. Rhett Carson dismounted quietly, his horse snorting soft clouds into the warm air. "You missed a few," he said, setting down a sack of nails. She looked up, startled. But something about his calm made it hard to stay embarrassed. "I didn't ask for help," she said. "Didn't wait for you to," he replied, crouching beside her. His shirt sleeves were rolled high, his forearms dusted with sawdust from whatever work he'd left undone to come here. For a long minute they worked side by side without a word, the only sound the hammer's rhythm and the soft creak of wood giving way. "You ever fix things that ain't broke just to stop remembering the ones that are?" he asked finally. She glanced at him, unsure if he meant the step or her heart. "All the time," she said. He smiled faintly, eyes still on the board. "Then we got something in common." She didn't answer, afraid her voice might betray more than she wanted. When the last nail was set, he leaned back, wiping his hands on his trousers. "Good as new," he said. "Better," she replied. "The first one gave way easy." "So will people," he said softly. "But you hold steady long enough, they'll come round." She studied him, the sun catching on the edge of his jaw, the quiet steadiness in his eyes, and felt something shift inside her. Not romance, not yet, but something like the first breeze after a storm. "Why'd you really help me?" she asked. "Because a man's got two choices," he said, standing. "He can let the world laugh at decency, or he can stand up and remind it how to behave." He handed her the hammer, their fingers brushing briefly. "You did more for them this morning than any sermon will this year." Her throat tightened, and she looked down to hide it. "I don't think they see it that way." "They will," he said. "Shame's loud, respect's quieter, but it lasts longer." He took his hat off again, as though the act itself had become a kind of promise. "I'll bring lumber by tomorrow. That step still creaks." "You don't owe me that," she said. "Don't mean I don't want to." Then, tipping his hat, he walked back to his horse and mounted. The late sun caught the dust under his boots, and for the first time all day, Clara realized she wasn't thinking about the tear in her skirt anymore. She was thinking about the way he'd said, "we." Morning came with the smell of pine shavings and coffee on the breeze. The church porch glowed under a soft sky, and Clara Wynn arrived early, carrying her sewing box out of habit, though she wasn't sure why. The boards Rhett had promised lay neatly stacked by the steps, their edges planed smooth, each one marked by a pencil line, as though measured with care only a craftsman would notice. She knelt to test the nails, and the sound of boots followed, the kind of steady, confident rhythm she now recognized without looking. Rhett Carson set down a saw and tipped his hat. "You beat me to it," he said, smiling. "Habit," she replied. "Can't let things sit broken too long." "Then we best get started." He crouched beside her, sleeves rolled high, sunlight catching the dust along his forearms. The two worked in unspoken rhythm, her threading the torn fabric from her dress between quiet glances, him driving nails into new timber until the boards sang when stepped on. After a while, she noticed how he paused between strikes, checking her face each time, as though gauging whether the sound unsettled her. "You work careful," she said softly. "Mistakes in wood don't stay quiet," he replied. "Same as people." Her lips curved faintly. "And what about mended seams?" He looked at her needle glinting in the light. "Those are where the story shows." They both fell silent after that, the kind that felt easy, not heavy. The wind carried the faint bells of a wagon passing through town, and a few curious onlookers slowed near the fence, whispering when they saw them together. Clara stiffened, but Rhett didn't glance their way. "Let 'em talk," he said, hammer still in motion. "They're just jealous the step found its footing again." She laughed, surprised by her own voice, and the sound startled a few sparrows from the rail. When he looked at her then, something unguarded flickered across his expression. Warmth mixed with respect. "I heard what they said after service," he admitted quietly. "Said you should have stayed home." "They always think you should stay where they put you," she murmured. "But if I keep doing that, I'll never move again." He nodded. "Then maybe it's time you built something that makes 'em talk different." "Like what?" she asked. He hesitated, then gestured to the church door. "Like a place that don't creak when you walk in." She smiled at that, feeling the weight lift from her chest. The last board slid into place, and he pressed it down with his palm. "Try it," he said. She stepped carefully onto the new wood. No creak, no give, just solid, quiet strength beneath her feet. "See?" he said. "Hold steady." "Maybe that's what decent people are for," she said softly, "to remind us what steady feels like." He met her eyes, and for a heartbeat, the morning stilled. Then he picked up his hat, brushed the sawdust from his trousers and said, "I'll be around tomorrow. Make sure it stays that way." She wanted to stop him, to say something that would match the weight of what he'd given her. But words felt small against the kind of kindness that didn't ask to be named. As he walked away, the light behind him spilled across the steps like a blessing, and Clara thought that perhaps, in this town where everyone watched, someone finally saw her for who she was, not what she'd lost, but what she'd learned to stand on again. By the next morning, gossip had spread faster than dust after a storm, but Clara Wynn didn't mind as much as she thought she would. She'd learned that when people didn't understand kindness, they called it something else. Still, she kept her curtains drawn while she worked the treadle on her sewing machine, patching shirts for the pastor's boys, pretending her hands didn't pause every time hoofbeats passed outside. Around mid-morning, they finally stopped for good. Steady, familiar steps coming up her porch. Rhett Carson tapped lightly on the frame, hat in one hand, a small parcel in the other. "Brought something," he said. She blinked, brushing stray threads from her lap. "For me?" "For your mending," he said, setting the brown paper bundle on her table. Inside lay fine linen, spools of blue thread, and a new pair of sewing shears, strong and silver, sharper than anything she owned. "Reckon you've fixed enough for everyone else," he said. "Might be time to fix something that's yours." She touched the shears like they were sacred. "You didn't have to." "Didn't mean I shouldn't," he replied. He looked around the small cabin, everything clean but worn, sunlight cutting through the thin curtains, highlighting a life lived carefully, modestly. "You keep this place like a prayer," he said quietly. "I keep it because it's all I've got," she answered. "And you?" "Same," he said. "Just got a bit more land to hide it on." She smiled, the first true one he'd seen. "So why bring me something?" "'Cause a man ought to remember the woman who taught a town what manners look like." "Manners?" She laughed softly. "All I did was tear a skirt." "And stand tall after it," he said. "That part's what they'll remember." Her gaze dropped, warmth rising in her cheeks. "They'll twist it." "Let 'em," he said. "You don't fight mud by jumping in. You just keep walking till it dries." She studied him then, the kind eyes, the patience in his voice, the way he always seemed to say what her heart hadn't dared yet. "You ever get tired of defending folks?" she asked. "Only the ones who think they don't deserve it," he said with a faint smile. "Like me?" "Like anyone good enough to feel ashamed when they shouldn't." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It hummed with something steady, like two hearts recognizing a rhythm they'd been missing. A breeze slipped through the open door, lifting the curtain and scattering a few threads from her table. He caught one in his hand, a fine blue strand, and twisted it between his fingers. "This the color you were wearing?" he asked. "The day on the steps." "It is," she said. "Then keep using it," he said, placing it back on the cloth. "It suits you." She nodded slowly, eyes bright with something unspoken. When he finally turned to leave, the sunlight hit his shoulders, and she noticed how his shadow stretched across her floorboards, long, strong, steady, like a promise she hadn't known she'd been given. As his horse carried him down the dirt road, Clara stood in her doorway watching the dust settle, realizing that respect wasn't just something shown in public. Sometimes it arrived quietly on your porch, carrying a small gift wrapped in paper, and a reason to believe again. By the week's end, whispers moved through Willow Creek like wind through wheat, soft at first, then sharp when it found corners to rattle. Clara Wynn felt them before she heard them. Conversations that stopped when she entered the mercantile. Glances traded over baskets of flour. The polite smiles that didn't reach eyes. "Saw her mending steps with him," someone murmured near the sugar barrel. Didn't waste time finding comfort. She kept her chin high, thanked the clerk, and walked out with her parcels. But inside, her chest felt like it had been stitched too tight. The same kindness that had lifted her now painted her in colors she hadn't chosen. She walked home under a sky too bright to hide beneath, each sound of her boots on the path matching her heartbeat. When she reached her cabin, she found Rhett Carson's horse tied near the fence, grazing. He was by the porch rail, sleeves rolled, mending a loose board without being asked. "You shouldn't be here," she said, setting down her groceries. "Seems I shouldn't be a lot of places lately," he answered. She sighed, glancing towards the road. "They're talking." "Let 'em," he said simply. "I've worked 20 years on the same land, folk talk, fence holds." "I'm not a fence," she said, the words trembling between defiance and fear. "I'm a woman who's barely held together." He straightened, wiping his hands on a rag, his face unreadable but kind. "Then maybe they ought to ask what kind of men tear down what a woman's trying to hold." Her eyes filled despite her will. "You make it sound easy." "Ain't easy," he said softly. "Just right." She looked away, voice breaking. "Do you know what it's like to wake up and feel like you're someone's story instead of your own?" He paused, then said, "Every man who's ever been judged by half the truth does." Silence hung between them until he added, "You saved me that day at the church too, Clara." "How?" she asked, startled. "By reminding me why I still go." She stared at him then, the edges of anger dissolving into something she couldn't name. "You ever wonder if God puts people in each other's way just to make us braver?" "All the time," he said. "Most folks just don't recognize the favor till it hurts a little." A faint laugh escaped her, wet with tears. "You talk like a preacher." "Nah," he said, stepping closer. "Just a man who's seen good women talked about by worse ones." The words settled deep, gentle but heavy as rain. She didn't move when he reached for the loose hem of her sleeve, threading the edge of blue fabric she hadn't finished sewing. "You missed a stitch," he murmured. "Then fix it," she whispered, not sure why her voice trembled the way it did. He tied the knot carefully, fingers brushing hers. No lingering, no presumption, just quiet care. When he stepped back, the air between them felt changed, charged, like something sacred had been acknowledged. "You'll never stop 'em talking," he said, "but you can sure make 'em tell a better story." She looked at him then, eyes bright with the ache of gratitude. "And what story are we telling, Mr. Carson?" He smiled faintly. "One worth listening to." As he mounted his horse and rode away, Clara stood on the porch, the thread still warm where he'd touched it. The wind caught it, fluttering in the light, and she thought maybe whispers couldn't break her if her truth spoke louder. The annual town supper filled the square with lantern light, fiddle music, and the smell of roast corn and coffee. Clara Wynn hadn't planned to go. She'd heard enough whispers that week to last a lifetime, and the thought of those same faces smiling falsely over pie turned her stomach. But when Pastor Reeves stopped by that morning with a polite reminder, "Forgiveness begins with being seen, Miss Wynn," she understood what he really meant. Prove them wrong without saying a word. So she ironed her one good dress, tied her hair back with a blue ribbon, and walked into the crowd just as the sun dipped low behind the church steeple. The music slowed, just slightly, the way it does when everyone notices something at once but pretends not to. Clara smiled anyway, nodding to Mrs. Gable by the cider table, and took a plate she didn't feel hungry for. That's when she saw him. Rhett Carson stood near the fire pit, sleeves rolled, helping the blacksmith lift kettles too heavy for one man. His shirt was open at the throat, his face touched by firelight and the kind of strength that made people fall silent without knowing why. When he caught her gaze, he didn't smile right away, just nodded, slow, steady, like he'd been expecting her all along. "Evening, Miss Wynn," he said when she reached him, tipping his hat. "Didn't reckon you'd come." "Didn't reckon I'd stay," she replied, forcing a half smile. "But here I am." "That's brave," he said. "Ain't bravery," she murmured. "Just tired of hidin'." He looked at her plate, empty but for bread she hadn't touched. "Then let me fix that," he said, taking it from her and filling it himself. A few heads turned, enough to make her throat tighten, but Rhett didn't care. He handed it back, his hand steady, his tone calm. "If folks got something to say, they can say it to me," he told her quietly. "You'd defend me again? In front of everyone?" she asked. "Don't see why not. Decency don't change just 'cause there's a crowd." She swallowed hard, the noise of the fiddle blurring behind her heartbeat. "They'll say it means something." "Then let 'em mean it," he said. "I've stood alone before." The way he said it, simple, honest, made something inside her unravel. "You don't care what they think?" "Not when I know what I see," he said. "And what do you see, Mr. Carson?" "A woman who keeps walking after the world trips her," he answered. For a moment, the chatter faded. Even the music seemed to hush. Mrs. Gable's lips parted. But whatever gossip she'd been holding died there. Rhett reached for his cup, lifted it slightly, and said, "To those who mend more than they break." A few men raised theirs, too, unsure but willing. Then someone clapped, and laughter followed, warm this time, not cruel. The tension cracked like a storm giving way to sunlight. Clara stood frozen, overwhelmed, the warmth of the fire catching the tears in her eyes before she could hide them. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered. "Sure I did," he said, smiling at last. "World don't fix itself." As the music swelled again, he offered his arm. She hesitated only a moment before taking it. Together they stepped into the circle of lantern light. Not as spectacle, but as proof that mercy could still silence a crowd, and that sometimes the gentlest gesture could turn a supper meant for judgment into a night folks would talk about with pride instead of poison. That night, the town's laughter faded long before Clara Wynn blew out her lamp. Yet the glow in her cabin refused to dim. It wasn't the lantern's light. It was something softer, slower, like warmth finding its way into places long shut. The supper had ended with small miracles. People meeting her eyes again, a child waving as she passed, even Mrs. Gable's nod that almost counted as apology. Still, when she closed her door, the quiet pressed heavy. She hung her dress, unpinned her hair, and saw the folded note lying on her table beside the basket of sewing she'd left that morning. The paper was thick, creased once, her name written in careful letters. Her pulse quickened. She sat, fingers trembling as she opened it. "Miss Wynn," it began in a steady hand. "If folks ask why I stepped forward that Sunday, tell 'em it wasn't pity. Tell 'em it was memory. Years ago, someone covered my shame the same way, with a coat instead of a hat. And I never forgot what it felt like to be seen clean again." She stopped reading, her throat tight, the words already blurring. "Maybe that's why I notice when good people get tripped by cruel ones. You don't owe me thanks. Just promise you'll let yourself be treated kind without thinking you've borrowed it. Respect belongs to you same as breath." It wasn't signed with his name, only a single word at the bottom. R. She pressed the note to her chest, as if warmth could travel through paper. For a long while she sat still, listening to the night creak around her. Outside, wind brushed through the pines, carrying the faint sound of a horse at the far edge of the field. She rose, went to the window, and saw a flicker near the fence, a lantern swinging slow from Rhett Carson's saddle as he rode home, its light moving steady through the dark. He hadn't knocked, hadn't waited for thanks, just left the letter and gone. That quiet thought undid her. She lit her own lamp again and carried it to the porch, setting it high where it could be seen from the road. For a moment she hesitated, afraid he wouldn't notice. Then she remembered his words. Respect belongs to you same as breath. So she didn't hide it. She left the door open, the lamp glowing against the night, her way of saying she'd received what he'd given. Not just help, but a kind of peace. Across the field, the faint light of his lantern paused, then dipped once in acknowledgement before disappearing into the trees. Clara smiled through her tears, the paper still warm in her palm. The gossip had taken pieces of her name, but that note had given it back. And in the hush between the fading hoofbeats and the whispering pines, she realized that the best kind of love didn't arrive shouting at your door. It left a letter and trusted you to find the light yourself. 2 nights later, thunder rolled down from the mountains like an old grudge, rattling shutters and sending livestock crying through the dark. Clara Wynn sat by her lamp, sewing patches by instinct, though the needle kept shaking in her hand. Rain slammed the roof hard enough to drown thought. Somewhere outside, wood splintered. She rushed to the window just as lightning flared, slicing the sky white, and saw it. The church steeple, struck and leaning, flames licking the eaves. Without thinking, she grabbed her shawl and ran into the downpour, skirts heavy, hair plastered to her face. The road was mud before she reached the hill, her lungs burning with every breath. People were gathering already, shouting over the wind, but confusion and fear made them scatter instead of help. "The roof's gonna go," someone yelled. "Ain't worth it," another shouted. Clara didn't stop. She reached the porch, saw smoke curling from the rafters, and then Rhett Carson burst through the doorway, soaked and blackened with soot, carrying the altar cloth like a shield against the sparks. "It's caving in," he called out, eyes catching hers through the rain. "Where's the pastor?" she shouted back. "Went for water." "Then we'll hold it till he's back," she yelled, surprising herself. He blinked, then grinned through the smoke. "You always tell a man what to do?" "Only when he listens," she said, grabbing the corner of the cloth with him to smother the embers. The storm howled, tearing at the boards, but together they beat back what flame they could, their hands red with heat, their breath ragged. A group of men, seeing them, finally rushed forward with buckets, ashamed into courage. For 20 endless minutes the town fought the storm beside them. When the last ember hissed into steam, the church still stood, scarred but standing, its cross leaning like a tired soldier refusing to fall. Rain eased into mist. Rhett dropped the cloth, coughing hard, his shirt torn open at the shoulder. "You're burned," she said, catching his arm. "Just a singe," he muttered, but she pressed her hand over the mark anyway, trembling. Around them, townsfolk watched in silence, their gossip washed away with the soot. Mrs. Gable stepped forward, voice unsteady. "Miss Wynn," she said, I misjudged you." Clara shook her head, still clutching Rhett's arm. "No, ma'am," she said quietly. "You just forgot what kindness looks like." The woman lowered her eyes, ashamed. Rhett's hand covered Clara's then, grounding her. "Town needed a reminder," he said softly. "Guess it took fire to show it." Thunder grumbled far off now, rolling away like a satisfied old judge. The pastor returned breathless, stopping short when he saw the two of them standing together amid the wreckage. The same woman once mocked on his steps. Now the reason his church still stood. He touched his heart, murmured a prayer, and Clara felt something inside her finally unclench. Rhett turned to her, rain dripping from his hair. You still afraid of talk? He asked gently. She smiled faintly. Not if it sounds like this? He chuckled, the sound low and worn. Good, 'cause they're sure gonna be talking tomorrow. And when he said it, she laughed, really laughed, because for once, the thought didn't sting. By the next Sunday, the air smelled of wet wood and lilacs blooming along the fence line. Clara Wynn woke early, the town still quiet, her hands raw but her heart light. The church stood rebuilt, roof patched, pews cleaned, smoke stains scrubbed to faint ghosts of what had been. She dressed in her mended blue skirt, the one once torn on those very steps, each stitch holding the story of what she'd survived. As she approached, morning sunlight spilled over the boards, catching the faint shimmer of fresh varnish where Rhett Carson had worked late into the night. He was there now, leaning against the porch rail, hat in hand, shirt still singed at the shoulder but clean. When she saw him, she stopped mid-step, memory flashing, the laughter, the shame, the hat he'd lifted between her and the world. Only now, the same steps held no fear. Reckon the town'll be early today, he said softly, turning to her. After last week, they'll come to see what still stands? She smiled faintly. Then let's give 'em something worth standing for. He offered his arm. She hesitated, but not from doubt. This time she took it without fear of being seen. Together they climbed those same steps, pausing at the top where the nail had once caught her dress. The wood beneath her boots didn't creak. It sang, solid and clean. The first wagons arrived, townsfolk spilling out in quiet waves. Pastor Reeves stepped forward, voice thick with gratitude. We owe you both our church, he said. Rhett shook his head. You owe it to her. She showed you how to stand when it's easier to turn away. Clara's cheeks flushed, but she didn't look down. He's wrong, she said gently. You owe it to kindness, and to remembering what it looks like. Mrs. Gable stepped closer, holding a small bouquet of prairie lilies. We remembered this time, she said, voice breaking. We truly did. Clara took the flowers, their stems cool and wet, and placed them on the repaired step. Then let this one never break again, she whispered. The crowd murmured their amens. Rhett looked at her, his eyes steady beneath the brim of his hat. Guess that's settled, he said quietly. What is? She asked. This town finally knowing who to follow when storms come. She laughed softly. They'll forget soon enough. Then we'll remind 'em, he said, slipping his hat back on. Long as there's wood to mend and hands to help. The church bell rang again, this time not to summon or warn, but to celebrate. Children ran up the steps that once tripped her, their laughter ringing where shame once had. Clara turned to Rhett, the wind lifting the edge of her skirt, sunlight warming her face. Do you still believe in miracles, Mr. Carson? I'm looking at one, he said simply. She blushed, smiling toward the horizon, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel like the town's mistake. She felt like its proof. As the service began and hymns rose soft through open windows, she stood beside the man who'd once offered a hat and given her back her name. And though no one said it aloud, every heart there knew it. Dignity, once defended, never truly tears again. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Echoes of the West. If you had seen her standing there, her skirt mended, her pride restored, would you have stepped forward too? Tell us in the comments.